Stocks, bonds, ETFs, straight out of downtown Chicago. This is Zacks Market Edge.
Welcome to Zacks Market Edge, the podcast about investing in your life. I'm your host, Tracy Reinick, and this week I'm joined by Nina Mishra, Zacks ETF strategist and also editor of Zacks Income Investor. This week's topic is one that I think hasn't been getting much play in the investing world, but I think it's one of the more interesting ones, and it's about the rise of India. Everybody's been saying India is on the cusp of greatness for probably a couple decades now, but it does seem some of the signals, I guess you could call it, are flashing green for them right now. And they seem to be a bright spot in the global economy. So Nina's here to talk about that. How to play it. We're going to talk about ways you can invest in India, because I think that's a little bit of the harder part of it, is how to get in there with, their companies and the stocks and that area. So at the end of the podcast, we'll be discussing some ETF plays and a few stock picks that you can do to get in there. But I think the ETFs are probably more the way to play India. So that's why we've got Nina here today. So welcome, Nina.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're going to start off with a little bit of the bigger picture, I think,
Sure.
because people do have their preconceived ideas about India and even just the emerging markets. I thought it was interesting, when you think of the BRICS in general, you pretty much don't think of the I, which is India, in there. It has, over the last 2 decades been Brazil, Russia, to some extent. And then, of course, the big juggernaut of China. And they have taken all the thunder. And now, China's slowing, their GDP is falling. And then we have India, who appears to be growing and, has a new government in place. They're doing a lot of changes with regulation. And suddenly, India is where it's at.
Sure. So as you mentioned, India appears to be the only bright spot in the global economy, and they are growing at around 7.5%.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Now, and this growth rate of around 7 to 8% is expected to continue for the next 2-3 years, at least as per World Bank estimates.
Yeah,
and even while they are growing so fast, there is still a lot of scope for improvement.
Oh yeah,
because GDP per capita is still very low. It is much lower compared to developed countries, and even China. So if the government takes the right steps, then there can be further improvement in growth.
Yeah, I saw some stats about that. I know because of this great GDP projection. Last year, they grew GDP at 7.2 is the stat I have. And then China was at 6.9, as we know.
Yes.
These are the official numbers, I guess.
They surpassed China last year.
I know. So that was a big deal. And the Chinese, official media, I've seen some of their statements about this data and about the projections, because they are supposed to surpass them again this year because China's still weak.
Yes.
The Chinese maybe will do 6.5 to 7. They're hoping. And then we have these great projections for India above 7, maybe even 8. So they've been saying stuff like it's unrealistic, and they're saying it's an illusion. But they did give this statistic, which I do think we have to keep in mind, that the Chinese GDP in 2015 was 10.4 trillion, and India's was just 2.2. So they are much smaller, but they're growing at this faster rate now.
Yeah, exactly. And this weekend, there was an article in the Financial Times, and it basically talked about how Facebook and Google are competing with each other to provide connectivity in rural India to people who do not have any access to internet, and they're planning to use balloons and drones and satellites and whatnot.
That's a big deal.
It's a big deal, and it has the potential. India has the potential to become the biggest free internet market in the world, because China has restrictions.
Do they sell the iPhone in India?
Not directly. Apple cannot sell directly, but they sell through third parties. But Apple has been trying to open stores, and they have been trying to request the government to relax regulation to sell phones directly. So
I'm just curious, because if more people get internet, I know I would want, if I could afford it, I would want, a smartphone of some sort. I know the smartphone market has been growing there.
India is now the second largest smartphone market in the world. Last
Wow.
year, they overtook the US, in fact. And smartphones are very cheap over there. Smartphones with some very basic functions. They have access to some, very popular apps and websites. They're pretty cheap. Those plans are pretty cheap. So going back to that article, which I
Yeah.
was discussing, right now, about 300 to 350 million people have, access to internet in India. And that article quoted a study from Deloitte, which basically reported that if we can extend internet penetration in India to levels seen in developed countries, then that itself could almost double the country's growth rate.
Wow.
So that is the kind of potential which is there in India, because there is a lot which can be done.
Right.
And,
They're kind of playing catch up in a way.
Yeah, the new government has been doing the right things. I think, before the Modi government came to power, there were a lot of expectations. And
Right, a lot of pressure.
A lot of pressure too. And some of those expectations were rather lofty, because things in India don't change overnight.
What do you mean? I've heard some of those stories, like they try to build like a highway and it's like 6 years later and they're still building it. Like, yeah.
It's the largest democracy in the world with
Right.
a multi-party political system, and all those political parties, they have their own agendas and interests. So things don't, transformations do not take place overnight.
Right. And also politically, his party controls the lower house, right?
Yes.
But not the upper house.
Yeah, that's
correct.
correct.
It's kind of like here in the US where, the Republicans have, well, now they have both, but before, when it was the split parties, you can't get as much done, obviously, because your people aren't being able to push through some things. But I was looking around at some of the regulations that they are trying to push through, and I thought this was interesting too, just about going to their growth. They're trying to pass that goods and services tax, that GST tax.
Yes.
And that seems to me like could be a huge thing. It already passed the lower house.
And
it's
again.
pending in the upper house, of
again.
course. But there is, the opposition parties seem to be willing to negotiate a bit. Now, all this is political. We don't know what's going to happen. But it would be big because in India, every state has its own like tax system, its own excise tax, sales tax. This would create one bigger system, and it would just be easier for businesses to basically file and pay their taxes. Like right now, it's super complicated. If you do business in more than one state, you're doing all this paperwork and all this crazy stuff, and this would just make everything more productive. So that sounds like huge for me.
Yeah, that's going to be huge. And that is, tax reform was one of the things which, foreign investors in particular were expecting from the Modi government. And to be fair, because his party doesn't have a majority in the upper house, and some of these bills have been blocked in the upper house. So that is why it is not happening so soon. And last year, they lost 2 key state elections. So that kind of delayed their chances of getting majority in the upper house.
Okay.
And now there would be some critical state elections next year. So now his party is trying to be politically correct, because otherwise opposition always accuses his party of being, working in favor of the rich.
Yeah.
So that is another reason why reforms are going at a slower, but I think at a steady pace. And another measure which they took recently is that they are opening bank accounts for all families, all households in India. I think that is going to be a big, big move.
Wow, yeah.
Because right now, so many households do not have access to banking.
And to credit and all of that,
Yes.
things that go with that. I saw another regulation too. This one is also past the lower, so it's stalled in the upper too, but it was a new bill on real estate. And I thought this also could be a big driver because what it would do, it would require all the real estate projects to be registered. Like they would have to go get permits. This wasn't happening before. And everyone would know like what is being built there. They can't change the design in the middle. And then if you bought for new construction and you bought pre to when they built it, and you put down your sales deposit, they would have to put that in escrow. And if the project was massively delayed, they would have to pay you interest on that. So that gives them incentive to get it done at least close to on time and not be delayed by years where you have nowhere to live. So all these things like in this kind of real estate bill also I feel will really add to GDP because it's going to put some certainty in the real estate sector. For buyers, you're going to know, you're going to have rights. You're going to know what you're getting, and it's going to make it more attractive for investors.
Yeah, it's going to be good for buyers. It's going to be good for banks as well. They'll be more comfortable extending housing credit. And I I read that recently one of the heads of a major building companies, he was jailed because there was a lot of delay in construction.
Wow.
That is something which is unheard of in
Yeah.
India. So
I think
things
this bill does allow for
Yeah,
some like prison
yes,
time too if it gets really bad.
Exactly.
Wow.
So things are changing at
Yeah.
a slow pace,
Yeah.
but they are changing. And recently, they also introduced a bill which encourages investments in oil and gas industry. And India imports about 75% of its oil. So this is going to be huge, a
Yeah.
big thing. For
Do they
the
have
oil.
like a shale thing there?
No.
Or, like what is it? Like is it offshore drilling or
A little bit
or
of
is it nat
offshore
gas maybe?
natural gas and more
Okay.
traditional drilling.
Okay.
Rather
Okay.
than shale.
just
I haven't
curious.
heard about shale in India.
I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe they'll discover
Yeah,
something new
yeah.
after this bill.
Right,
But-
right.
but
yeah,
not as of
because
now.
people will be willing to take the chance to explore
Yes,
now.
exactly. And last 2 years, kind of Modi government has been very lucky because of low oil prices. Because 2 years back, when they came into power, India had very high rate of inflation and a widening fiscal deficit. And those problems have been kind of chronic for the Indian economy. Now, with the plunge in oil prices, inflation has come down from almost double digit to like around 4% now, 4 to 5%. And fiscal deficit also has been, contracting because they were able to eliminate a lot of subsidies on diesel for poor people. So that has really controlled the fiscal deficit. So things going to be moving in the
Wow.
way to be moving in the right direction.
Now let's discuss a little bit because I think some people might not really understand why Apple is going through these hoops to try to get into the country. But they've always had this really restrictive view on allowing like outside brands and businesses to come in and open up. Because I remember there was always Indian Coke. There wasn't like Coca-Cola couldn't get in there. And so that was a way of kind of protectionism to, so their own businesses could have that business. But is that starting to fade away or will that still be, decades further down?
It may take some time because even as of now, they do not allow majority ownership by foreign companies. You can have, partial ownership, or you can have an Indian subsidiary with another Indian company, but you cannot have, majority ownership. So those things are some of the reforms which, foreign investors wanted, but they are moving at a very slow pace. So it's not going to happen anytime soon, I think.
Okay.
But maybe 2-3 years from now,
Yeah.
you may see Apple selling its phones directly in India. That's a possibility.
Okay. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I remember when Starbucks first went in there, they did have to partner with a local Indian company that was going to basically run the coffee houses and all of that. But that's their way of getting in there.
Even Amazon is not able to sell directly in India. They have
Right.
to partner with other third parties to sell the stuff over there. And India opened up its economy just about 25 years back. For about 45 years since independence, they followed kind of socialist pattern of government.
Okay.
And then in 1991, the economy was suddenly collapsing. They had a foreign exchange and balance of payment crisis, and they had to borrow from the IMF. And, there was a part of, under the terms of, conditions of that
Right.
loan, they had to open up the economy. Because before that, all the banks, airlines, major industries, everything was state controlled.
Okay.
So as part of those liberalization measures, they had to open up their banking systems and airlines. But some industries, they are still heavily controlled by the state, and they do not allow majority ownership by foreign companies. But recently, they opened up the food processing sector also to, foreign investment. So things are changing. So
Okay.
maybe a couple of years. The pace has been slower than expected, but
Right.
But yeah, some
But now
improvements are
we're
taking
still
place.
going. And you're starting to see that reflected in those GDP numbers.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Let's talk about how to play it as an investor now. Because I know you've brought a couple really good ETFs. Because I do think that's kind of the way that
Yeah.
the average American who wants to play India, the ETFs is just easier.
Yeah, it's just easier because there are about 10, 12 maybe Indian stocks which trade on the US
Right.
exchanges. So rather than investing in one company only, you can look at ETFs which provide you a diversified exposure to the entire economy.
Yeah.
And MSCI India ETF, the ticker is INDA. That is the most popular and also cheapest in this space.
Okay.
And But one should remember that these large cap ETFs, they are dominated by technology.
Okay, that was
Like,
I was just going to bring that up because I
like-
was looking at these and I noticed how different they are than like the Chinese ones or some of the other ETFs where it's much more manufacturing or industrial or even mining, and then the Indian ones are not.
Yeah. So if you opt for these large cap ones, probably you are getting more exposure to technology companies and some banks also. So if you really want to play the consumer in India or the rising middle class in India, then probably small cap ETFs.
Okay, so they
could
have
be
one?
Yeah, there are two.
Okay.
And the ticker is SMIN, which is the MSCI India Small Cap ETF.
Okay.
And there's another one called SCIN. These are both
both small caps.
small caps. And there is one ETF which focuses only on consumer sector. The ticker is INCO. This is by X-Shares. The problem with that ETF is that it hasn't really become popular with investors. So,
Okay,
assets,
so it does have
assets
small
are, it's still
volume
very,
and-
very small in terms of assets and trading volumes. So that increases the trading costs, and there's a little bit of closer risk too.
What do they have in the consumer one? Like, what is
The smaller companies, consumer staples.
Is it like restaurants or is it like food or?
all,
I don't know.
all kind of
All of
small.
it. Okay.
Yeah, if you look at holdings, things like Godrej, ITC,
Oh, okay.
even entertainment like Z Entertainment.
Okay.
Procter and Gamble is a big player in the consumer staples industry in India. That is also one of the holdings. Emami, which is a cosmetics company. So that kind of exposure
Okay.
you get if you invest in that particular ETF.
And that's where I'd want to be if I thought, the country is really growing, the middle class is
Yes, definitely.
increasing,
their
people's
incomes
incomes.
are rising. Middle class is expanding. Their incomes are rising. People are willing to spend more on things like
Yeah.
entertainment. Netflix made its entry in India recently.
Oh, wow.
So people are spending more on entertainment.
Is that in
dining.
streaming? Are they streaming over there? Do you know? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they are.
So
they
this
are.
is play on the internet thing.
That's a play on the internet thing, but
Yeah.
I don't know whether it is going to become very popular in India because there are obviously internet broadband issues.
Right,
So
right.
whether it would be buffering all the time or streaming properly, I don't know.
I don't know.
I'm yet to hear the feedback on Netflix from anyone.
Yeah. I'll be interested to know how that
Yes.
works. Remember how bad that used to be, even in the U.S., like when it would buffer and you're like at this key scene and it starts like the little
Yeah.
thing is circling and you're like, no, like what's happening? Like just hurry up and fix yourself. So yeah, that could be an issue.
That could be a big issue in India. So we will see.
Okay, so that's some good ideas for the, to get in there and play it in a broader way. I looked at a couple of the stocks because you and I were talking about them because it is so narrow. There's not that many. But one of the ones I have liked over the years was Tata Motors. Most people would know them because they bought out Jaguar Land Rover in 2008, kind of when everything was going bust. And
Yes.
they were trying to sell, automakers were like, we'll just get rid of this division. And I thought that was a good buy for them because it got them
that was
into
a very
the
smart
luxury.
decision,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah, and they've really cashed in on that in China because that brand, all those brands were popular in China and the luxury market there. But the China business has declined. I
Yes,
noticed
economy
because of
is
what's going on
slowing
over
down.
there. Yeah, and then their domestic business has always kind of been good, not spectacular as you might think because cars are expensive and you still need the growth and that middle class growth in order to buy
Yes.
one. But aren't they? They're launching a new small car soon.
Yes, unfortunately, it was named Zika earlier.
Uh-oh, that's
And
not
they
good.
had to change the name. I think the new name is Tiago.
Okay.
That was selected through a public vote.
Okay,
They
okay.
called for suggestions through social media on Twitter and their Facebook and
Now,
all
does
that.
Zika have some other meaning in India? Like,
No,
it's just a cool name.
I think it was a combination of zippy and car, something like that. I read
okay.
something like that. And Tiago is also just a name. It
Okay,
doesn't have
just
an
made up.
Indian
Right.
meaning,
Okay.
Hindi meaning.
That's well. At least they were able to change it
In time before
yeah,
launch.
before they
Yes,
launched it.
Exactly. So
Yeah, because
So let's see how smaller cars are, usually more popular in India, though some people like to own bigger cars just for show off. But
Okay.
given, how crowded Indian streets
Yeah.
are and how difficult it is to drive over there, smaller cars are more suitable for Indian roads.
Now, who is buying the cars over there? Is it upper middle class? Like, who would buy this
Upper
new
middle
car?
class buyers, they would like to buy,
Okay.
bigger cars, but smaller cars like Tiago and the other one,
Okay.
Tata Nano, those cars are usually bought by middle class and
Okay.
even lower middle
Okay.
class
Okay.
Indians.
Huh. Do they have any restrictions in the major cities? I know, like London taxes you if you drive into there to keep the number of cars lower. And I know in Shanghai and Beijing, they limit the number of cars and the number that can be purchased, even, I think, in those cities. Are there any kind of restrictions like that? Or?
In Delhi, they tried to do something like that on a particular day, only odd number cars,
Oh.
with cars with odd number registration plates could drive.
Okay.
And on the next day, only cars with even number registration plates could be on the roads.
Yeah. Did it
And
work?
I'm not sure whether
don't
it has been working properly. And there are people who have like two cars in the household. And
I was going to
maybe
say, what if you had one with the odd and the other one was the even? You would
Yes.
just switch off on whichever car you drive. I don't know if that's solving anything.
Yeah, so I haven't heard much about that, so I don't know
Okay.
whether it has been very successful, but it was a good experiment.
Yeah.
And probably we'll get to know about the result, how successful it has been in a couple months from now, whether there has been any control in amount of traffic on the roads
Yeah.
and in air pollution also.
Okay. Tata Motors trading around 8 times. So I do consider the shares to be pretty cheap. They have bounced off the recent lows, but people investors don't like the auto companies in general right now because they do think we've kind of reached peak auto.
Yes, even in the US.
Yeah, any of them they don't really like right now. So most of them are pretty cheap, but if you're looking around, you have a little bit longer term horizon. Tata is one to keep on the list there. And then the other stock I brought is one of the banks. It's the second largest bank in India, is CC Bank. Its ticker is IBN. Oh, I think, did I say Tata Motors? Their ticker is TTM, just
Yes,
for
yeah.
people to know that one. CC Bank, I used to own this, I want to say like 10 or at least 10 years ago, because I was looking for a way, this is before they really came out with the big countrywide ETFs, and I wanted a way to play India, and it paid me a dividend, which I did look up this time. They're paying a 4.5% yield, which is pretty good. And they were the biggest one. They were, well regarded internationally. And then just looking at them again now, in their recent quarter, the loan growth was really rising. They had domestic up 20%. Their retail was up 24%, but retail is 44% of their loans. On the commercial loan side, those were up 15.8% in the quarter, and that was, year over year, and that was after 10 consecutive quarters of declines actually on commercial side. So that's actually a really good sign, again, for the economy, that the
Exactly.
commercial side is really growing. Their tier 1 capital ratio is 12.76% to be
Pretty
exact.
healthy, yeah.
So all the analysts I saw thought that was a good ratio, and so they're not too concerned about the asset quality right now. And even if there is some questions or problems with it, that they have enough, on hand to
Reserves.
cover it. So I kind of like a bank play. I can't believe I'm saying that, but when a country is growing, I mean,
Yes.
the first thing you got to grow is your credit, and you got to give out the loans, and that starts the businesses, and that buys the automobile.
Yeah, definitely. So in India, 2/3 of banking system assets are still controlled by the state-run banks.
Okay.
In China, I believe it is more than 90% even now.
Yeah.
And India had started opening up, the banking sector to private banks, as I said, about 20, 25 years back. So these private sector banks have been doing really well. They have grown so much, and ICICI Bank is now the largest private sector bank in India. And they don't have as much as bad loans as the state-run banks have. State-run banks account for almost 90% of bad loans in India, and their capital levels are also not good enough, healthy enough. Many of them will need recapitalization from the government. On the other hand, these private sector banks, they have been growing their capital levels, as you mentioned, also it's 12 point something. So,
Yeah.
so they seem to be in a very good position to meet the Basel requirements also for capital norms. Their credit quality is not so bad, and they have seen nice growth in earnings of late. And I had read that ICICI Bank had increased its provision for bad loans because they had a review by the central bank. So
Yeah.
voluntarily, I think they
Okay.
increased their loss reserves for bad loans. And as the economy improves, I think they'll be able to increase their more profitable loans to consumers, and that will probably push growth further for banks like ICICI and HDFC.
Yeah, weren't you telling me that their CEO is a woman? I
Yeah.
thought that was interesting.
Yes, yeah. In fact, banking sector is dominated by women in India. It's a very interesting thing. I mean, women were.
Why is that? Do
women-
we know?
Yeah, I think traditionally women have been interested in banking careers rather than going out in the fields. And IT was not big. Technology is very big in India now.
Right.
It's a big employer, Infosys, Wipro, and TCS. But 25 years back,
Right.
I think banking was the preferred, career for women. So that
Okay.
is why many women, they were in the banking career. And ICICI ICO is a woman, the largest public sector bank in India, State Bank of India. Its CEO is also a lady.
Wow.
And there are many other lady who are top women bankers in India.
Wow, I had no idea. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's a good thing to know.
Yeah. I wonder if they do better loan programs for like women entrepreneurs and things like that because they have the women
Yes.
in their system already.
Yeah, definitely they must be doing. And there are some programs which are focused entirely on women, and these bigger banks, they have partnerships with smaller regional rural banks also. And those regional rural banks, they have branches in villages and all that, and they
Yeah.
work with the local artisans and local women, small women entrepreneurs, and provide loans to them. They form self-help groups also for training financial literacy and all that. And those self-help groups are able to, obtain loans from those regional rural banks. So that is a good thing going on in India.
Now, most of the Indian economy is still like a cash only though,
Mm-hmm.
right? Isn't that right? Like most people don't have credit
Yes.
cards.
Yeah,
It's-
not many people have credit cards.
Okay.
So even the likes of Amazon and Snapdeal and Flipkart, they
Right.
have cash on delivery systems
right,
as
exactly.
well.
Yeah, they're almost operating like banks these days, it seems.
Yes, but there are some new startups which are doing pretty well in the payment area. There's one which is called Paytime or something like that.
Okay.
It's growing pretty
Yeah.
well, and it's a good one. So I think things are going to change in China. And in fact, this online payment system is much more developed
Yeah.
than in India. So India still has to do a lot of catching up to do in that area.
Okay, so maybe if the Chinese media was saying, it's an illusion or whatever they were saying, it's unrealistic, that's maybe something that they're talking about. Like they're a little bit behind. But as an investor, I want to be in areas that are on the upswing, that are, have this tremendous growth because everybody, like I said at the beginning of this podcast, for the last 20 or 30 years have been saying like there's so much possibility there. There's so, it's a democracy. There's so much, just number of people. There's just going to be growth there.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the way, the harnessing of it has been the problem up until now, it seems.
Yes. I mean, literacy is one of the problems. So if the government is, able to take right steps and improve the quality of life in rural areas and provide education to people, then things are going to, improve in the coming years. And as I mentioned earlier, only 350 million people in India have access to internet as of now. So just imagine the
So
potential
small.
people having access to smartphones and then buying things online.
Yeah.
All those things are going to grow tremendously in the coming years. So it's the economy that definitely has a lot of potential. And for anyone expecting overnight transformation,
Right.
that is not going to happen. It's going to be slow and steady.
Yeah.
So last year's budget, in fact, many investors were disappointed. Indian stocks did pretty well in 2013 and 2014 because in anticipation of and after Modi's election. And last year they were expecting some big bang reforms in his
Yeah.
first budget. That did not happen. So this year, the expectations were low, and the budget kind of delivered.
Okay.
At least the government maintained its commitment towards fiscal discipline, and there were some reform measures also which were announced in the budget. So investors liked the budget, and stocks have kind of surged after the budget.
Okay.
And
Are they cheap? Would you consider Indian stocks to be cheap now, or
looking at the longer term growth potential, I think they're at a good price. Maybe.
Okay.
And in case of India, these stock markets are, very much dominated by foreign institutional investors, unlike China, which are stock market is
Can't
mostly
get in there.
mom and pop investors, and especially the mainland
Yeah.
China market. In India, foreign institutional investors play a big role in stock markets. So earlier this year, because of this risk-off attitude and in general aversion towards emerging markets, a lot of foreign institutional investors, they had pulled their money out of India. And that impacted the currency too. And even though last year the currency had held up really well, while all other emerging market currencies had collapsed. But this year, rupee had plunged to its all-time low against the dollar sometime in February. But after the budget, and in general, after the improvement, after this risk-on sentiment and improvement in attitude towards investors' attitude towards emerging markets. So Indian stocks have been doing pretty well over the past few weeks. The currency has also recovered nicely. And it seems that the earnings season is going to be good. So maybe this may be the right time to look at some of the stocks and ETFs.
Yeah, definitely. One last question. What about gold? Whenever I think of gold, I do think of India because it has, such a strong demand there.
Mm-hmm.
And in the past, it has actually caused spikes in the gold price and stuff based on the buying season for weddings and things
Yes.
like that. Is that still the case?
Yeah, and Indians always, they're very fond of gold jewelry.
I know.
So,
I love it.
Yeah, so when the wedding season around September, October, at
Okay.
that time, gold prices definitely go up in India. But the government is now trying to, curb gold imports. So they have imposed some restrictions and there are some duties on gold imports. So that is why gold is not as much liked by Indians, especially for investment purpose, because
Okay.
it has become costlier to own gold now, as they used to in the past.
Right.
But jewelry still remains.
Oh yeah, that's not going anywhere.
Favorite.
Yeah, who's gonna take away the jewelry? Nobody. It's so
Yeah.
beautiful.
Right.
Okay, so we discussed a couple ETFs. I'm going to go through the tickers again in case people missed them. We had INDA and SMIN and SCIN. And then the consumer one was INCO.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. And then we had a couple stocks, Tata Motors, which was TTM, and the bank, which I've been saying wrong. So you've been saying it obviously correctly. I'm not going to say what it is. It's just IBN.
Yeah. It's ICICI Bank.
Why do I call it? I guess because I see it as, I don't know. I wouldn't have thought to call it that.
It was called, I think, Industrial Credit and Investment
Oh, it
Corporation.
had like some long name that they,
Yes.
that's probably
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
So
I
they
see.
converted it into a bank later. It was a credit corporation. It was a big financial
So it's not really
institution.
a word like I was trying to pronounce it as a word, but it's really just the letters of the longer
Yeah,
name.
exactly.
I see. Well, that's good to learn these things. So if you want to read anything else about India or ETFs in general, be sure to check out Nina's articles because they're all on Zacks.com, and she provides great information about what's going on in the ETF world. So check those out. And you can always, of course, check out our other podcasts on SoundCloud.com. And we're also on iTunes. And you can find us also on Zacks.com. This is only our first podcast on India in general, but I think we'll probably be doing this more frequently because I do think some good things are going to happen with India this year and next year. So this is an interesting topic. So from Chicago and with Nina, I'll see you next week.